playing somewhere. I'm gonna need them for volunteers at the end. So see how many I need. Six. All right, we're back in session. This hour, we're going to talk about transmission. To me, some of the most interesting stuff, but we'll see what you think after the end of it. But we're going to talk about how the Bible was handed down from generation to generation and reaches us through that process. Uh, so often, this is where the Bible is attacked. When we talk about transmission, it's a cornerstone of both Islam and Mormonism that the Bible has been corrupted over time. And that's why there's such an emphasis in Islam and in Mormonism on memorization. In Islam, they believe that the only way to prevent jinn, which are genies essentially, from corrupting the word of God is for you to memorize the Quran. So they believe that otherwise genies can affect change, and that's what happened to the Bible, is that genies messed with it and corrupted it over time. That is a cornerstone belief. They don't talk about that belief very much, but that is one of their beliefs. And that's why they believe in Jesus, that he was a good teacher, but that he was not the final prophet, that was Muhammad. The question then arises, of course, about this is that since we have zero autographs, how can we be sure that we have the accurate word of God? How can we be sure that it has been handed down to us correctly? So we'll talk first about the fact that in Hebrews 1, all right, in Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2, it starts out by saying, long ago and at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. God has a variety of ways that he has talked to humans throughout history. A few of those are up here on the screen. God walked and talked with Adam and Eve. He used angels as messengers many times. The casting of lots, the Urim and Thummim, which is fun to say over and over again. Not really, not fun to say. And then the casting of lots, indeed, for choosing Matthias as the replacement apostle for Judas. The voice of conscience, Romans 2 talks about that our conscience talks to us in that way. Now, it's not the Holy Spirit whispering to us. It's our conscience that has not been seared, that we get through the Word of God. Our conscience is sharpened by that. And in that way, God uses our conscience to speak to us. He put our conscience in us. And then that's true also of creation. Particularly Romans 1, talks about the idea that creation speaks to us. So we're without excuse. We have no excuse for not believing that there is a God. But Romans also talks about the fact that we can't determine the plan of salvation from just observing creation. His voice, several times he uses his voice to speak. He did that, of course, at the baptism of Jesus. Direct miracles, he has used that in the past. He no longer uses miracles, but he used miracles in the Old and New Testaments to speak and to confirm his word. And then prophets were given the power to speak for God, and they were inspired by God. So each of these methods was the perfect way for God to communicate to those people at that time for his message. But they are either incomplete, such as what we can determine from creation, or limited in time and place, such as the spoken word. Written messages are much more precise, and they're able to transcend time and space. And for this reason, God chose the written word to communicate his message to us and to all of mankind for all time. And he chose specific languages for that purpose. On the screen, we have Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. These are the three languages of the Bible. And the Old Testament, of course, is written predominantly in Hebrew. And then the New Testament is written predominantly in Greek. And then there are sections of each that are written in Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of God's specific people, and his message for them was communicated in that language. And it is of the Semitic family, as is Aramaic, and it's a specific language for a specific people. The Jews were God's chosen people, and his message was to them in that language. And then we see a dramatic shift in the New Testament, and God's chosen language to communicate the New Testament to us is Koine, or Common Greek. This is an Indo-European language. It was the lingua franca of the time. That means it was the international language because Alexander had conquered the world, essentially, and he had spread the Greek language throughout. Now, Rome was coming into power, and before long, the lingua franca would be Latin. But at this specific time, God chose Greek, which is a very specific language, but is meant for all people. So it's fascinating. We see God's plan being put in place in that way. And then he froze that language. Koine Greek basically was done away with, was replaced by Latin within about 150, 200 years. So that language doesn't morph and change. Now, there is modern Greek, but Koine Greek is basically a frozen, dead language. And so we can determine exactly what God meant at that time in the New Testament. And so we see God's plan being put into place in that way. Now, Jesus also spoke Aramaic, as evident through his various quotes and his utterances on the cross are in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the Near East, and it was originally the language of the Syrians. It's also certain that Jesus could read and speak Hebrew. The evidence of that is when he reads from the scroll of Isaiah in Luke 4, 17 and 18. And he also speaks to Saul in Hebrew. Now I imagine, Jesus being God, he could speak in any language that he wanted to. But as a human, when he was here, we know that he could speak in Aramaic and in Hebrew. And when we talk about transmission and handing down the Word of God, critics like to attack the Bible, and what they say is this is like the game of telephone. I don't know if young people still call this telephone now that we don't have phones in the same way. But the idea here is that one person will whisper to the person next to them, and you're only allowed to say it one time. You say a word, such in this case as peas, and then the next person, they might mishear it, so they might say, well, I think he said bees. The next person says knees. The next person says cheese. The next person says fleas. They usually do it with a long phrase, and it comes out as kind of gibberish on the other end, and it's funny, and everybody laughs, and I don't know how you win that game, but that is nevertheless what they say the Bible transmission is like. And critics are just absolutely wrong here. That is not how transmission of the New Testament or the Old Testament was done. When we talk about transmission, we're talking about the work of professional scribes for the Old Testament. Now, there are no images or statues of scribes, Hebrew scribes. There are, however, for Egyptians. They wouldn't do that if you were a Jew because that's a graven image. And so there are no graven images of Hebrews being scribes, but we know what scribes worked like, what they looked like. And here are some images of Egyptian scribes, which is in the same neighborhood as Israel. There's a great article, you can look it up online, called In Praise of Ancient Scribes. I think it was written in the 80s, but it's all still true today because it's based on history. And it just talks about the rigorous work of these people. A scribe was a person whose entire job it was to copy text. They didn't have any Xerox machines. They didn't have any laser printers. If you wanted a copy of a book, you had to get someone to handwrite that copy for you. If you wanted to preserve it, you had to make handwritten copies. At the time, the Bible was being produced, there were not even any printing presses. This is all done by hand. So the only way to make duplicates was by hand. And you see some of that. There's a couple of them. There's one over here, and I had one up here before of scribal work from 1250 in France. I have a couple of 1250 AD, and you can see how beautiful it is, and also how careful they were. The material that they're working on is valuable. What they're writing down, of course, is valuable, and they took it very, very seriously. They were paid to do this. This was their entire job. It required specialized skills, specialized training, and they had to get really good at it. And I will say this: I have done a little bit of scribal work to try to get a sense of how they did. And I've started to copy the book of Genesis recently. I messed up on the very first word, and I had to start over. That's how difficult it is. And then a couple pages later, I made it 2 pages without messing up again. I skipped a page in my notebook, so there's an entire blank page. I realized later, it's easy to make mistakes, and say, okay, well, if it's easy to make mistakes, how do we know that they did a good job? Well, first, I'll show you some of the tools of the trade that we found. We found these pens that look like this, and I have examples of those up here. Inkwells, scrapers to scrape parchment, things of that nature. And they worked in what are called scriptoria or scriptorium. This is the scriptoria in Qumran, in the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This is the scriptoria. You see, it's a long rectangle room. They would sit on the floor, sometimes what we call crisscross applesauce, right? And they would hold the document that they're writing in their lap, and they would have a reader, a trained reader. This was an advanced scribe who was trained in precisely reading text and spelling out difficult words, who would read at the front, and then multiple copies would be made from the younger scribes who were sitting there. For short notes, they would stand, but the typical position would be sitting. Later, they figured out that they should be using desks. So medieval scribes, they used desks. But ancient scribes, all of them look like they sit on the floor all the time. This is back-breaking kind of work. And we see some scribal notes to that effect. And scribes for the Bible, particularly at Qumran, what you find is by their cells, they have these baptismal pools. And they would essentially wash themselves in a purification and a cleansing before they would go in and write the Word of God. That's how seriously they took it. They're taking it very, very seriously, and they would never add to or take away from it. They would consider that a sin. So they're taking their work very seriously. And then in addition to that, because of the way they copied, it's really easy to inspect the work. And you can see that in some of the examples that I'm going to show, but they would have a senior scribe go back and check their work. Quality control. So scribes would hold themselves accountable by signing their work. A senior scribe would go in and check the work. And in addition to inspection, scribes had several methods to check themselves. The text was written in one continuous line, and they would have so many letters per line and so many lines per page. So they would be able to check the endpoint of every single line and make sure those letters were correct. They knew the midpoints of each page, the midpoints of books. They would check, they would literally count all the letters to the midpoint and make sure that it matched the one that they were going off of. Oftentimes they would mark, and you can see a little pin prick on every single 10th line. So they can go back and check every 10th line and make sure that they didn't skip a line or add a line. You usually find people skipping a line of text. You don't find them copying the same line twice because you're copying, and you do not want to keep copying another line. So they usually skip a line by mistake. They'll find that, and when they find it in the scribal notes, they'll make a little note and they'll go add it in between the lines where they skipped. So you can see where they corrected mistakes. Oftentimes, they would then be signed by the senior scribe that he inspected it and he agreed that this was good. But you can imagine the difficult and exacting work that this would be. At the margin, at the end of some of these books, they would write little scribal notes, and some of them are pretty funny. Some of them are like, there was one that was a really difficult Latin text. It wasn't the Bible, but they were copying it in the note. I've kind of collected some of these notes. One of them said, "There's an end to that," and basically, I'm glad to see it in the rearview mirror. I don't want to ever have to copy that book again. And there are a couple of times when they were writing out Homer, and someone dies in that book. He's like, the scribe expresses his sadness at that character dying, that kind of thing. So it's neat. Sometimes you get these little kind of touches of humanity in there. But one is, there was an Irish scribe that said, "Sad it is that, little variegated white book, a day will come in truth when someone over thy page will say, the hand that wrote it is no more." So they realized that they were copying something that would outlive them. And so they were very careful about that. Now, even with that, there are, of course, what we call variants or errors in the text. And they come in essentially two flavors. They come in intentional and unintentional. Now, unintentional errors, because of the abundance of manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, there are an abundance of unintentional errors. And again, this is where critics will attack the Bible. They will say, well, there are 400,000 errors in the biblical text, variants, and you can't possibly know what the original was. Well, the reason there are 400,000 variants is because we have so many manuscripts. And when you have so many manuscripts, it's easy to make small, unintentional mistakes. It's also really easy to see those mistakes and figure out what they are and why they are. And I'll show some examples of that here in just a minute. But this in no way indicates that the Bible is corrupted. It's really easy for a scribe to misspell a word, particularly names, which if they misspell a word, it would create a nonsense reading in the Greek. It's easily corrected. It's easy to see when they were introduced through the history of manuscripts, and it's easy to correct them. Sometimes they would skip a letter or a word, or occasionally an entire line. Sometimes they would duplicate a letter, a word, or rarely an entire line. Sometimes they would leave something out. And because we have so many manuscripts to use, we can compare these and we can figure out through textual criticism what the original meant. Now, that's for unintentional errors. What about intentional errors? There are some of these. And what we see are things like corrections in euphemisms, in grammatical form. Sometimes spelling is modernized. Those types of things. These are typically the kinds of intentional errors or variants that we get. Not where they're trying to introduce false doctrine into the text. It's more trying to modernize the language. If you take a look at the 1611 King James that I have up here, anybody who really loves King James, I always ask them, okay, well, will you read out of the 1611 King James? Because it's quite different than the one that you use typically that was redone in the 1890s. The original King James is difficult to read. The F's or S's and U's or V's or U's, whatever it is. And there are additional letters that we don't even have anymore. So there are some difficulties in that has been modernized. That's kind of what you see in scribes as time goes on. Those are most of the intentional errors. There is one that is interesting. One of these changes is an attempt by the scribes to correct what they perceived as an historical error in the biblical text. In John 19:14 and Matthew 27:44 and 45, they harmonized it because they thought, well, somewhere along the line, somebody got that wrong. Because God wouldn't get it wrong. We've got to harmonize that. And so they fixed the time. The Bible gives two different times for Jesus' crucifixion. Well, as we studied that and as we went on, we see that Matthew is using Jewish time, and Mark, I think I said John, but I think it's Mark, was using Roman time. God knows more than man ever could, and he includes that detail to confirm his word. And what you find when man tries to fix what God says, man messes that up. God got it right the first time. God doesn't need our help to fix anything. He put that in there on purpose to confirm his word. And because of the abundance of early manuscripts, it's easy to see where these changes were introduced. And it's on very, very rare occasions. There's things called interpolations. I'm not going to have time to go into all that, but that's where very short sections are added. And those are also easy to figure out, and I'd be happy to talk to you about them if I had more time. We can certainly discuss it at lunch or up here when I'm showing you this stuff, but it's just difficult, too much material to get to in this. As we start to look at manuscripts, this is that scroll that I have up here of Leviticus. I want you to understand something about scrolls. They're big and they're bulky and they're difficult to use. They're difficult to carry, and they wear out really quickly. I showed some people the repairs that have been done on this. It's about a 500-year-old scroll, and you can see that it's been damaged multiple times and repaired multiple times. Scrolls are hard to use and they're hard to conceal. You're not going to easily hide that thing if you're trying to do so. There is decent evidence to show that Christians basically invented what we think of as the book. Mainly because if you bind something and then you put boards or wood over it, it protects it and it makes it much easier to conceal than a scroll. So some of these Christians were facing persecution from the Jews and in some cases from the Romans. They needed to hide those texts and preserve them. It was hard to make those texts. They had to hand copy those texts. If somebody got them and burned them or destroyed them, it's very hard to replace. And so they essentially invented small books. And the New Testament was originally put into 4 different sections. And this is how we find manuscripts. We find the 4 gospel accounts together, typically. Acts and what are called the general epistles are usually bound together. The Pauline epistles, usually including Hebrews. Don't know what you think about whether Paul wrote Hebrews or not. Happy to discuss that with you at length as well. I go back and forth on it, but I'll fight either side of it. It would be fun. And then the book of Revelation is usually kept separate by itself. That's how we find copies of them. And that's because they're easy to conceal that way. Now, again, we don't have any original autographs, nothing by the hand of Paul himself, but we know what they would have looked like. This is P. Oxyrhynchus, which Oxyrhynchus is just a town in Egypt, an ancient garbage dump that they found, and they found a whole bunch of manuscripts in it. This is one of the manuscripts that they found. This is the earliest letter possibly from a Christian to another Christian, because he talks about loving him with brotherly love. Now, he doesn't talk about anything biblical or spiritual, but he just talks about that in the closing. So some people feel this is an early Christian letter. It is a first century letter. This is what the original manuscripts of the New Testament would have looked like on sheets of papyrus, just like this. So we can kind of see what those early writings look like. And we date these manuscripts in a number of ways, one of which is called paleography. Now, this is just looking at the type of text, the alphabet that's used, and how they went about copying it, because we know at different times, different methods and different lettering and things like that were used. So they use paleography. And I can show an example of this by just using English. So Old English looks like this. And You may have trouble reading it just because it's small on the screen, but you'll definitely have trouble reading it because it looks nothing like English. It's Old English is a foreign language to us. I can't make out any of those words in Old English. And you can see that there are all sorts of letter forms, and the way they did things are just different than anything that you see. You get up into Middle English, and the font's a little bit better, but it's still really hard to read because they even use letters that we don't use any longer. So you can use those types of things to date a text. So we know when some of these texts were written because of the type of letter forms and the using what's called paleography. So that's how we know when things were written. And when we look at the Bible, the manuscript evidence is overwhelming. Like we're gluttons compared to the rest of the ancient world. I teach a lot of Roman history, and I talk about things like Nero. We hardly know anything about Nero from written history, and the history that we have, really bad. It's just terrible. Like the manuscript evidence for it is bad. A lot of it is lost. There's 2 whole years of his reign where we have nothing written about him. Nothing. And yet people talk about it like we know everything there is to know about Nero. It's really, really odd. But you compare any ancient manuscript, any ancient book to the Bible, and the Bible just dwarfs it. I'm going to take a look at some of the biggest. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were essentially religious books to the Greeks. They were memorized for hundreds of years. They were used. They were written around 900 BC. The earliest manuscript we have of the Iliad or Odyssey is from 400 BC, 500 years after it was originally written. And the number of copies we have is about 643. Which is a lot. That's a lot of copies. And so they're fairly confident in the text based on that. Other works are much worse. The works of Aristotle, who wrote in his lifetime between 384 and 322 BC, the earliest manuscript we have of Aristotle is from 800 AD. That's 1,100 years after Aristotle wrote. That is the earliest manuscript we have of Aristotle. And we only have 49 copies of his work. Some of his works are just lost. So it's interesting to see that. You look at someone like Julius Caesar. Got to hold my mouth right. Julius Caesar, who lived 100 to 44 BC. The earliest manuscript we have of Julius Caesar's writing on the wars is from 900 AD, 1,000 years after he wrote it. And we only have 10 manuscripts. You get to Plato. It tricked me. It almost did it. Who wrote 427 to 347 in that time period. The earliest copy we have, besides one 3rd century BC fragment that you see on the screen there, is 900 AD, 1,200 years after he wrote. And we only have 7 manuscripts of Plato. So these are all obviously well known. Pliny the Younger, who we have some of his letters. 61 to 113 AD is when he wrote. The earliest copy we have of his letters from 850 AD, 750 year time span, and 7 copies of that available. And we compare all of that to the Bible. There are 5,800 plus Greek manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament. 5,800 copies. And the earliest we have is the Rylands Papyrus from 125 AD. So within a few years, decades from when it was written. The manuscript evidence we have on the Bible far dwarfs any other manuscript evidence for any other ancient work. It's shocking how much more material we have to go off of with the Bible. thousands and thousands of copies, and good copies. And then, if that were not enough, on top of that, the Bible, especially the New Testament, was instantly translated. So as soon as they would receive a copy of this, people would start copying it. They would start translating it and distributing it. We have over 10,000 Latin manuscripts, ancient manuscripts. We have 9,300 other translations from Syriac and Slavic and Gothic and Coptic, Ethiopic, Armenian, and other ancient languages. And even if you lost all of that, if you lost all the manuscript evidence, all the 5,800 Greek texts, all the 10,000 Latin texts, all the 9,300 other translations, 99.6% of the New Testament is quoted in the works of the so-called church fathers, the early Christians who wrote books about religion, quoted the Bible, and particularly the New Testament. So we have 99.6% of the New Testament preserved in their writings. So it's just overwhelming manuscript evidence for the Old and New Testament. Then this thing works really well for a second. All right. The Green Collection, which is, he's the Hobby Lobby guy who funded the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. If you've never been able to go there, I encourage you to make a trip. It is a fantastic collection where he has used millions and millions of his dollars that he got from Hobby Lobby to buying up artifacts and Bibles from all over the world. In fact, he got a little bit too eager, and he bought some what's called war loot from Iran and Iraq, and he had to return a whole bunch of that. He got in trouble from the U.S. government, and he had to return over 11,500 artifacts. But they are bringing in the Dead Sea Scrolls at the end of the year, this year, and they're going to be in 3 different waves where parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to be on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. So you can see a lot of these things. I have a nice little collection, but I didn't found Hobby Lobby, so I don't have millions of dollars to throw at it. But I do have some things. And we're still finding manuscripts. It's getting more difficult to find them, but there's a couple of sources that we do have. One is called cartonnage. That are the wrappings around mummies. Now, in order to find them, you have to destroy the wrappings of the mummies. So if they peel those layers back, they sometimes find writing in there. And that's where some of these manuscripts are now being found, not just biblical manuscripts, but old ancient manuscripts of poetry and plays and things of that nature are also found. Highly controversial since you have to destroy the mummy to get it. So they're not doing a lot of that, but when they do, they do find things. The most exciting thing recently is the scrolls of Herculaneum. Now, these were found charred like this, a whole library that belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law in Herculaneum. And they found all of these scrolls in there in the 1700s from when Vesuvius blew its top and covered Pompeii in ash. It covered Herculaneum in kind of mud, and it charred all these scrolls. Well, they're still preserved, but they couldn't peel them back and see anything. They figured out, they destroyed a few of them to try to read them, but they finally decided, look, we got to quit messing with this. Maybe technology someday will be able to read these. Today is someday. So they recently have been using, it's sort of like an MRI, and then combining that with AI, they are able to read the text through the layers of these scrolls. And the first one that they released, they actually found the burial place of Plato from that scroll. So there's some hope. Now, probably the father-in-law of Julius Caesar didn't collect biblical manuscripts, so we probably won't get any biblical manuscripts, but we will get other ancient writings from that time period, and that'll be pretty exciting. And so that's where we're finding some of the new ones. They come in two basic types: uncials or uncials, and cursives or minuscules. Uncials are older Greek manuscripts all capital letters. He's making a run for it. And then they are all capital letters, and they are all run together. And cursives or minuscules are a combination of capital and lowercase letters, and they are a little bit newer than uncials. This is what it would kind of look like in English, where they run everything together. And this is also an area where critics will sometimes, where they don't understand Greek. But even in English, it's not hard, I don't think, for you to be able to read that if you put a little bit of effort. And if you get used to reading it, if your Bible was in this kind of text, it becomes pretty easy to figure out where the breaks in words are. Well, in Greek, it's even easier because they have word endings. It's pretty much impossible to not know where a word ends in Greek. So they don't really need spaces. And this is what it would look like. And you can read that, right? Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called, right? You can read that. This is one of the critics said this is an example of how this can get messed up. Did you ever see abundance on the table? Or is it, did you ever see a bun dance on the table? I think you can pretty well tell that that's a nonsense reading and not something that would be realistically in the Bible. And so these are not not great ways to criticize the New Testament. Early letters were dictated and would have been in an uncial hand by somebody who was a skilled secretary in these types of things. We see this mentioned in Romans 16:22, where Paul is using an anamensis, which is someone who is trained as a scribe, and he's writing this out for Paul as Paul dictates it. You also see it in Galatians 6:11. And there, this is what the ancient uncials look like. This is Codex Sinaiticus. They are all, the three great uncials are online, and we're going to talk about each one of those briefly. There are three great uncial copies of the Bible. And these are the Vatican or Vaticanus, Sinaitic or Sinaiticus, or an Alexandrian or Alexandrinus. I can't say it, so I just say Alexandrian. But these are the three great texts of the Bible, the great witnesses that we have, particularly of the New Testament. Codex Vaticanus is kept in the Vatican. Yeah. Good guess. Correct. Nobody said it, but I'll say it for you. It's kept in the Vatican, although not ever. It's never been on display, and it is not on display now. Recently, was at the Vatican. Was hoping that it was. I didn't know if it was on display, and I came to find out they do not ever put it on display. But that's where it was, and it was there at least since the 1500s when Erasmus received a copy of some of the text. In 1669, Bartolocci made a collation of readings from it, but it didn't become public until 1819. Napoleon took it from there when he conquered Italy as a prize of victory. It was returned to the Vatican in 1815, but it was studied while it was in Paris, and that's where they kind of realized how important it was. I'm going to talk about this guy Tischendorf here in just a minute. He was allowed to study it for 6 hours in 1843. In 1844, Demeralt was permitted to study it for 9 hours. In 1845, there's a guy named Tertullus who was allowed to see it, but not copy any of it. And his pockets were searched before and after. And there were two monks that stood at his side. And if he stared at any reading for too long, they would try to distract him and turn the page so that he didn't memorize any of the readings or anything like that. In 1866, Tischendorf was again allowed to see it. And while nobody was looking, he copied 20 pages of it. They caught him, and they did not allow him to see it again for a long time. For another year. Then he was allowed to see it for 14 days for 3 hours a day, where in that time he memorized as much as he could, and then he published a copy of it based on his memory of it, which is pretty impressive. Don't think I could do that. Then they finally issued a photographic facsimile of it in 1889. And it is missing the beginning up to Genesis 46. Some of the Psalms are also missing. And it's also ending, the ending is missing Hebrews 9:14 till the end. Parts of Timothy, Titus, and Revelation are there, but there are some missing pages. But it's a very important early witness to the text. The second one that we have is Sinaitic. This is probably my favorite just because the story behind it is so great. Constantine von Tischendorf, which is one of the great names of biblical history. This guy is like the Indiana Jones of nerds. So he made it his life's mission to find early manuscripts of the text, and he would raise funds to do that. One of his missions was he went to St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt. It is, of course, still there. It's one of the oldest monasteries. And you'll notice now there is a little house down there. That's the door to get in. For hundreds and hundreds of years, there was no door to get in or out. It was just these walls. And then you can kind of see, does this thing have a laser? Oh, it does. But you can't see the laser on the TV. But you can see the little, right above that house, there's a little thing. They drop a rope down there, and you could get in and out from that rope. That's the only way. And they have one of the greatest libraries ever of early manuscripts. Tischendorf went there, and he was going through it. He found some of this manuscript in a basket, he said, of fire, of kindling to make fires. They were using it to start fires. And he was given permission to take some of them, but he got really excited, and they were like, hey, maybe we shouldn't let him take that. Maybe that's something valuable. And then he returned after he gathered more funding, and he couldn't find it. And on the last day he was there, one of the monks invited him to his cell to see a copy of it that he had, and it was this manuscript. He collected it himself, and this time he calmly asked if he could borrow it and take it to his chamber to study. He stayed up all night and copied as much of it as he could. Then he asked to keep it, but the head of the monastery had left. So he had to go chase him down and then beg for permission. And they gave him, according to him, permission to keep it. According to them, permission to borrow it. And then he took it to Russia, that was the Tsar of Russia was the guy who funded his work. And then later, much later, they sold it. The Russian government in 1933 sold it to the British Museum. I don't know how familiar you are with the British Museum, but they tend to get things that are questionable. And this is one of them. This is my favorite meme about the British Museum, where they just like to go around the world and collect things. And for a while, Britain, of course, was the ruler the sun never went down on the British Empire. And so they have a lot of stuff like this, but they did buy this for £100,000 in 1933 from the Russian government. When it came to the museum, there was a large crowd that was waiting for it. And when they took it out of the taxi, all the men took their hats off. It's really neat. There's like newsreel footage of this, and there's also newsreel footage of them taking this very valuable and fragile manuscript, and they're like looking at it and turning the pages and talking about it. And I'm the whole time I'm like, please be careful. But it's one of the most important manuscripts of the Old and New Testament. Of what must have been about 730 leaves, there are 405 that remain today. It's now split into 4 unequal sections, with the bulk of them, 347 of them, being at the British Library. They did find, in 1975, there was a fire and a wall collapsed, and they found a hidden part in St. Catherine's of more manuscripts. And they found, I think it's 12 full pages of it. Those have been digitally reunited with the rest of them, so they've been scanned in, and you can see the entire manuscript online at the British Library. St. Catherine's very much would like them to give that back, and so far, every time they ask, the British Museum just says, well, they usually say nothing, but basically they've said, nah, we're going to keep it. Thanks. Um, and then there's the Alexandrian manuscript. It's 773 leaves, 630 of the Old, 143 of the New. Old Testament is almost complete. The New Testament is missing a considerable amount. Now housed at the British Library. Yeah, you guessed. Good guess. So they did acquire it as well. And all of these are online, and you can take a look at them. This one was one time in Alexandria, but it made its way to London via a gift. Meant to go to King James I, but he died, so it was presented to Charles I, who had it. It was in Charles I's library, which burned. And Dr. Richard Bentley, who's my hero because he's a librarian, he ran into the burning library and he saved one thing, which was the Alexandrian copy of the Bible. So in all the king's manuscripts in this library, he chose to save this one thing. It is a 5th century and very important manuscript of the Bible. There are others, including Codex Ephraim. I don't have time to tell you all about Tischendorf, but Tischendorf also was instrumental in this. Other people had tried to make copies of this, but it is what's called a palimpsest, or scraped again. So somebody had taken this very important early manuscript and scraped it off of the vellum. So if I took sandpaper and scraped that off so that I could copy my sermon notes, that's what they did. So he took a very important manuscript of the Bible, scraped it off, and wrote his sermon notes over it. And it looks like this. And by candlelight, in the National Library in Paris, Tischendorf made a copy of that. So over time, if you scrape that text off, over time the ink comes back up, and you can kind of see it underneath the other text. That's what a palimpsest is, and that's how he got famous. Is he made a copy of Codex Ephraim by hand. It took him 2 years. And then Codex Bezae is in Cambridge University since 1581. It's bilingual with Greek on one and Latin on the other. It's less reliable, but it's valuable in tracing the history of the text. There are 322 total registered uncials that are currently on record, and we have found many of them in the past few hundred years. There are actually 324 on record, but one has been lost, and one was a multiple. So it was, in other words, it was a piece of another one. So it's now classified with it. But we have 324 of these that we have to go off of, and they are fantastic. The best one in America is Codex Washingtonianus. Try to say that 5 times fast when you're standing up in front of people. It is a 5th century copy. And it is in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. I've asked to see it a couple of times and never been allowed to see it. It's not on display. It's very, as you can tell, very fragile. And they don't allow people typically to see it, except scholars. And I'm not scholarly enough to get access, I guess. But the minuscules are useful because they show how carefully the text was passed down. They show how it's transmitted and for confirming scribal errors. There are several important ones of this, including the P45 through 47, which is the Chester Beatty Papyrus. This is of different parts of the New Testament, but it is the earliest copies of Paul's letters that we have. And P52, which is the Ryland Papyrus. That's the one I have a copy of here. That's the earliest copy of John. I want to talk to you just briefly about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we're going to break for lunch because I'm hungry too. But I'm on Eastern time, so you can imagine how hungry I am. But Cave 4 is where a lot of the scrolls were found, including the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is just amazing. It's an almost complete copy of Isaiah. I've gotten to see this twice. It came to Chicago when I lived there, and I went and saw it there. And I also saw it in Israel. Actually snuck that picture of it. That picture, it's on that spindle around. Right after I took that picture, a guard screamed at somebody to not take pictures. And I thought he was screaming at me. And fortunately, he didn't see me. But I didn't take any more pictures after that. He was very serious about not taking pictures. So I didn't. And this on the other side is the tiniest copy of the Bible in the world. They built it with an atomic microscope and nanotechnology. And it's that little bitty dot that you can just barely see is an entire copy of the Old Testament. So that's pretty cool as well. Now, before we can break, I want to talk about why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. I need 6 people to volunteer, and all you have to do is stand here and look pretty. It's not hard. You just have to hold a sign. It's not hard at all. All right, come on up front. 6 of you. 1, 2, and 3. Oh yeah. See, my son's brave. 3 more. We're not going to get to eat until you volunteer. So, all right, stand across here, and we're going to do this. I know this won't get picked up on the thing, but I'll put it up in a second. All right, somebody has to be the law of Moses. Stand across right here. All right. So the law of Moses was written in 1440 BC. Here we go. It'll be the law of Moses. That's when Moses was written. Isaiah was written in 700 BC. Malachi, the end of the Bible, is written in 400 BC. Skipping you. And the life of Christ is right here, 4 BC to AD 30. We can talk about why it's 4 BC later, but not in this class. So, life of Christ, 4 BC to AD 30. And the earliest manuscript we had of the Old Testament was the Aleppo Codex from 935 AD. So that is the earliest Hebrew manuscript we had of any of this text. Now in Isaiah, there are a whole bunch of prophecies about Jesus. And critics would say those prophecies were introduced into the text, and you don't have any proof that those prophecies spoke about Jesus before Jesus existed. And that's true. We didn't have any manuscript evidence that those prophecies were there until they found the great Isaiah scroll. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found right here, discovered in 1947, written in 150 BC. So the great Isaiah scroll predates the life of Christ. And guess what? It has all of those prophecies in it. So the critics had already said those prophecies obviously speak about Christ, but they were added after Jesus was born and died and rose. But all those prophecies were already there, and we have proof 150 years before Jesus was ever born. All right, guys, thank you. See, that's my little demonstration to show you how it proves that the Bible is from God. That we look at that. I can put it up on the screen too, so people on the internet can see. Right here, Dead Sea Scrolls prove that those prophecies predated Christ, and they so clearly talk about Jesus. So the Bible is so good at answering critics. And to me, it's just the most impressive book in all the world. All right. When we come back after lunch, we'll talk about the canon of Scripture. We'll talk about the books of the Old Testament. So, all right. Thank you very much. We're going to have a prayer, I think, now for dismissal and for the meal.